Learning question. What are the contexts of an inspector calls? What is context? Context refers to a time, a place, a group of people. An inspector calls has three contexts: Britain in the year it is set, the time it was first performed, and our context. The play is set in a very precise time. Mr. Burling says, "A friend of mine went over this new liner last week, the Titanic. She sails next week." We know that the Titanic sailed on the 10th of April 1912 and sank on the 14th of April that year. So the play takes place on one night in the first week of April 1912. Priestley picks 1912 for many reasons. It was a year he knew well. He was 18 in 1912 and working as a clerk in a wool firm in Bradford. The years between 1910 and 1914 have been referred to as the Great Unrest. Britain's economy was booming. The rich had never been richer. But wages had not risen with prices. Indeed, from 1901 to 1910, wages had shrunk 10%. At this time, the British people could be said to be divided into three classes. The upper class was made up of the nobles and gentry who had inherited money and land over hundreds of years. Joining them were men, and they were mainly men in this sexist world, who had made huge commercial success out of the Industrial Revolution. These were the richest people of the wealthiest empire in the world. Below them were the middle class. These were professional people, lawyers, bank managers, teachers, engineers, merchants, clerks, and so on. They probably benefited from grammar schools, which were designed to train them for secure entry into this class. They were the administrators of the empire. Priestley was the son of a headmaster. He had a grammar school education until 16, and he was a clerk. Below them were the vast majority of the population, who were the working class. These were men and women who relied on their physical labour to earn money. They were factory workers, coal miners, dock workers, shop workers, servants, and so on. Priestley explicitly refers to the Titanic because its passengers were severely divided into three classes, with first class sailing in absolute luxury and third class stuck in steerage just above cargo. Below the three classes were the underclass, people out of work, criminals, the mentally unstable, the most desperate of the desperate. By 1912, the gap between the upper class and the working class would be greater than at any time in the 20th century. It was also a time when industrial disputes were brutal and deadly. In March 1911, 11,000 workers went on strike at the Singer sewing machine factory in support of 12 female colleagues who were protesting against poor working conditions. The strike was defeated and 400 alleged ringleaders were sacked. There were 872 strikes in Britain in 1911. By 1913, this had nearly doubled to 1,459. During 1911, Liverpool transport workers were involved in street battles with mounted troops that climaxed with the shooting dead of 2 strikers. There was a national railway strike resulting in more men shot by the army. The political unrest extended beyond the fight for wages and work conditions. In November, suffragettes, campaigning for votes for women, stormed Parliament, were arrested and imprisoned for 3 years. Industrial accidents were common. A huge factory explosion in Liverpool killed 39 and injured over 100. And this was a small death count compared to coal mine explosions that were known to kill hundreds of workers. In 1912, 1 million coal miners went on national strike from February to March, the month before an inspector call starts. The Times newspaper called this the greatest catastrophe since the Spanish Armada. There was talk in upper-class circles of people arming themselves against the threat of the working class. Later in that year, hundreds of thousands of cotton factory workers and London dockers would also strike. These years of unrest continued after 1912. London cab drivers, London busmen, male and female metal workers in the Midlands would also go on strike. In Ireland, which was then still part of the UK, transport workers would go on strike for 8 months. These were millions of men and women who merely wanted a fair day's wage for a fair day's work. It is during this time of great riches and industrial expansion, of huge political upheaval, of grinding poverty, that Priestley set an inspector calls. Priestley may have been 18 in 1912, but he was 52 when the play was first performed in Britain. Many of the audience of 1946 would have remembered these times. They were only 34 years ago. It is as though someone writing today set their story back around 1982. The difference is that between 1912 and 1946 there had been huge changes. There had been 2 world wars which had accelerated technological and social change. This is the second context of an inspector calls. From 1939 to 1945, there had been a national government coalition of all political parties, and the entire population was mobilised as part of the war effort. People of all classes found themselves in the armed forces, working down mines, working on farms, working in factories. Queen Elizabeth II, then a teenage princess, was an army mechanic and lorry driver. There was a real sense of we're all in this together. There was also a huge feeling that we did not want to slip back to how things had been. The consensus for change would lead to the election of a reforming Labour government in 1945, who would make changes that we still benefit from now. It is this government that created the NHS, massively modernised our education system for all, expanded our welfare systems, and took control of major industries to help build an economy that served everyone, not just the few. This and more is the sort of society that J.B. Priestley wanted, and an Inspector Calls is designed to remind people that this is how things were and that we're all responsible for each other. This brings us to the third context of an Inspector Calls, our context. How could a play written in 1946 and set in 1912 talk to us? Apart from the human story of characters faced with difficult decisions and competing loyalties, how do these contexts relate to ours? Well, as I said earlier, we know that 1912 was the year when the gap between the rich and poor was at its greatest. We have detailed statistics that show our country had become gradually more equal by 1946, and this trend would accelerate after World War II. In fact, it would continue right up till 1979. But then things would change. Not only that, but since 2008, the gap between rich and poor has massively widened. We live in a country where billionaires and their corporations make huge profits. We have many wonderful things, but we also live in a country of food banks, 0 hours jobs, public services underfunded, a country where child poverty is growing and real wages are stagnant or shrinking. Not only is Britain now a more unequal society than the one I was born into, it is actually more unequal than the Britain of 1946. If J.B. Priestley was alive today, what would he have thought? So, an Inspector Calls has three contexts: the world of rich and poor in 1912, the post-war 1946 world of hope, and our context, where these issues are still with us. Perhaps we should also ask, shall we slip back? Until next time, thank you for listening.